Hello, and welcome to the Families USA webinar. This is our Families USA Health Action webinar. We're glad to be talking to folks from across the country today on our topic, No Partial Expansion, Next Steps for States. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we are talking with our Families USA Health Policy Director, Elliot Fishman, and Matt Sloniker, who is the Executive Director of the Utah Health Policy Project. I'm Patrick Willard, and I'm kicking off today's webinar. I am the Senior Director for State and National Strategic Partnerships here at Families USA. Today we want to dive into what has been announced just within the past week, which is the decision by the Trump administration not to allow partial Medicaid expansion to receive the full funding that's allowed under the Affordable Care Act. One of the places where this issue has been at the forefront is in Utah, where the state legislature adopted a plan based on promises that they had received from federal officials that they would be able to receive that full federal funding for only a partial expansion. So we'll be talking first with Matt Sloniker from Utah Health Policy Project about what's happening there in Utah, and then we'll go to Elliot Fishman from here at Families USA to talk more in depth about what this means nationally and what may be next on the horizon. So a few housekeeping announcements just to begin things. We will be making the slides and the recording available after today's presentation. We want people to feel free to ask questions, but we need you to ask your questions in the chat box on the computer. So type in your questions as you are listening to speakers, as the questions come to mind, so that we can know what the questions are beforehand. And then once we conclude our presentation, we'll try to go quickly into the questions and answer as many questions as we can. Today's webinar we have scheduled for an hour, and we'll be taking up a good portion of that time. I don't know that we'll be covering the full hour for today's presentation, but we wanted to be able to get to this issue now because it is something that has been out there for state advocates for some time. And in fact, besides Utah, we have seen some state legislatures think about going for a partial expansion. For example, we saw in Georgia there was a look at seeking a waiver there for a partial expansion, which hasn't been put together yet. And we've seen some action in Tennessee where the legislature has asked for a per capita cap waiver, and that waiver is still being put together now. So we thought it was important to go ahead and talk to people today about this proposal, which is that a state could just go up to 100% of the federal poverty level and get a 90-10 federal state match for its funding for the Medicaid expansion for that partial up to 100% of the federal poverty level population. As we know, in the past, CMS turned this request down when it came from Arkansas and when it came from Massachusetts. But here we had a situation in Utah, which was one where CMS officials seemed to be suggesting that they were going to be able to get to a yes on the partial expansion with the full funding. And so today we're going to start off talking to hearing from Matt Sloniker, who is the Executive Director of the Utah Health Policy Project. Matt has been involved for the past several years in the Medicaid expansion effort there in Utah. And so, Matt, I'll turn it over to you to talk to us about how we got to this place in Utah, what it meant for the advocates in Utah, and where things stand now as we're moving forward. So, Matt Sloniker, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate you all covering this issue today. Of course, it very much surprised us late Friday of last week, this announcement and the report out of the Washington Post that I'm sure a lot of you have read by now. And so, yeah, here we are in July, getting close to August, a lot of people away on vacation, not much going on, and this breaks. So it really did provide an injection of energy into the conversation around Medicaid expansion. And, I'll tell you, we were just in the middle of, well, let me back up real quick. Let me give you a quick backup or sort of a refresher as to what happened in Utah. So last November, we actually passed, as a state, Proposition 3 to expand Medicaid under the banner of Utah Decides Healthcare. And that ballot initiative won by a pretty decent margin. We felt we were pretty confident in going into the legislative session that we had a mandate from Utah's voters that we would go ahead and expand Medicaid per their request and do so in a fast and efficient way, traditionally, clean, with sustainable funding mechanism. We had raised the state sales tax and had enough revenue to go ahead and pay for Medicaid expansion. And so we thought we were in good shape. Well, lo and behold, the state leaders had been sort of secretly planning for efforts to undermine, repeal, replace, however you want to look at it, the voter-approved initiative. A bold move, but in Utah, we've had kind of a storied history in the legislature doing things that aren't really within the parameters of what the public wishes. And this was an instance that was very clear because we actually had not just polling, but we had an actual vote during a midterm election indicating the direction the voters wanted Utah to go. So these secret meetings were carried out through into November and December, early January. Mid-January, we start our legislative session, and announcements start to percolate that a repeal and replace effort is underway, and it doesn't look good. So, not going into too much of the history with what happened during session, I'll basically just leave it as, they did repeal and replace our Medicaid expansion ballot initiative. And the first phase of what they replaced it with is something that they called a bridge plan. A bridge plan to sort of buy us some time while we sought out some waivers from the federal government to do the Medicaid expansion the way that our state legislature and governor wanted it to be done. We coined, or we sort of, borrowed their phrase by using the analogy of a bridge, and we created the graphic you see on the screen indicating, look, this is a broken bridge. There are a lot of holes. There are a lot of problems here versus Proposition 3, the ballot initiative, which was a very straightforward, very stable and smart bridge to take. So we used that graphic as we worked through, the sort of session, and then post-session got into the waiver comment periods as they wrote the waiver, released the draft, and like I mentioned earlier in Friday, we were sort of mid-comment period. We were in the sort of mentality of let's generate as many state and federal comments as we can. We'd had some success there, generating a few thousand comments, and we had plans to have more events throughout the summer to generate more comments, and we're really ready for a longer-term fight on this first phase, or this first waiver the second phase, really. I'll talk about the phases in a minute. It's sort of confusing, but the first phase of the waiver. And so this really did throw things up into the air. I think we sort of were surprised last Friday, but also somewhat celebratory. We immediately got numerous state and national calls from media, and of course we didn't even know really what was in the post, what that meant, and we were trying to figure that out, trying to ask some of our state partners, folks that had heard from the Trump administration directly, people in the governor's office, the state legislature, to try to determine what exactly had happened. Well, it took a few days to really figure it out, and really the dust is still settling. We still don't have a clear lay of the land quite yet. But I'll tell you, some of the reporting that came out originally on this, and even some of the sort of tweets and commentary from national level thought leaders on this, were a little off base. There was this sort of tendency to attack Trump for not approving a Utah expansion, and sort of that's kind of true, but it's in reality it's good that the Trump administration didn't approve this waiver because of all the bad stuff in it. And so, there was a lot of confusion around what was SB 96, the legislative authority to pursue these waivers and the sort of repeal and replace plan. What did it look like? What were these phases that were in SB 96? A lot of the media and our colleagues, both nationally and locally, and us, we had to go back and remind ourselves what exactly happens next here. And, then there were rumors that, they're going to just, go to special session right away and repeal SB 96 and repeal the Medicaid expansion. So just a lot of confusion, a lot of paranoia, a lot of sort of just, the rumor mill got going. But let me explain a little bit about SB 96 just so folks understand. Again, that's the bill that gave authority to the State Department of Health to pursue these waivers rather than implementing Medicaid expansion as directed by the voters in Prop 3. So the first phase is something you may have heard about. That's Utah's current expansion. So we currently have about 20,000 people enrolled in a Medicaid expansion. Utah got approval from the federal government at a 70-30 FMAP, so our traditional FMAP, 70-30, to go ahead and expand up to 100%. That was what was coined the original bridge plan to buy us time to potentially get these bigger waivers, in the future. So phase 2 is the phase we were in. So we got the expansion. We've got about 20,000 people enrolled, and that number grows every day. It's a slower uptake than we thought it would be, and than the state thought it would be, but there is that expansion. Phase 2 is where we were. That was the effort to essentially ask the feds to grant a waiver for Medicaid expansion only up to the 100% federal poverty line, but getting the more generous match at 90-10 that the Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion provides for. This waiver also would include a bargain on a per capita cap with the federal government, and it would include a work requirement, enrollment caps, as well as a number of other bad provisions. So part of the confusion on Friday was, well, what exactly did they reject, and what exactly didn't they reject? And it's clear that they rejected the 90-10 match up to 100%. And presumably, by virtue of logic, the state of Utah wouldn't want to chase down a per capita cap necessarily and tie their own hands if they didn't get a more generous match. So that goes down, I think, with the 90-10 match as well. Well, what is still out there in this big waiver that potentially could still get approved? And that brings us to phase 3. So phase 3 is, okay, if we don't get the generous funding for a partial expansion, then we need to still propose to the federal government another waiver that includes enrollment caps, work requirements, and anything else we can get that we want out of them in order to do Medicaid expansion. But the expansion at that point, of course, would be up to 138% and draw down the 90-10. So that's the phase we're in now, and that's kind of, a lot of folks are a little confused about, whether or not we can go ahead and implement full expansion in a clean way right away, or whether or not we have to go through these other steps. Our belief at Utah Health Policy Project is we want to create a public narrative that suggests it's not wise to continue to chase waivers. Here, in sort of, mid-comment period, the Trump administration, jumps in and just says no. They'd been guaranteed. So folks in the Trump administration and at CMS had essentially all but guaranteed that the 90-10 match up to 100% would be approved. There are a number of politicians in Utah with a lot of egg on their face and that are I think, rightfully humiliated by the things that they said during session in trusting the Trump administration. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. You don't want folks to feel too humiliated. They're harder to work with when they're trying to defend themselves. But what I'm trying to get at is this was something that our legislature and our governor believed in. They believed it would happen. Frankly, they didn't think mid-session during this last legislative session, they didn't think they would ever need a backup plan. They were that confident. It was only after convincing by advocates and certain legislators who were worried to make sure there was a backup plan in a phase 3 and a phase 4. So, fortunately, we do have these backup plans. Unfortunately, we're now in the position of working through this phase 3 where how do we message we don't like full expansion, right? Because that's what it is we're going to have to say, is we don't like this type of a full expansion because it has a work requirement, it has an enrollment cap. And again, this is early. I'm assuming that's what they're going to go for in this next phase. The SB 96 has some guidance there, but again, I don't know exactly what has been rejected, what hasn't been rejected. We haven't been able to see that information. It seems as though it's the 90-10, but it could be other things as well. Again, going back to our messaging, we want the public to go ahead and move on to phase 4, which is if you don't get phase 3, then you go to traditional clean Medicaid expansion that's financially sustainable. And that's where we want to end up. So we're in this phase 3 time period. We're trying to message, look, we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of waivers again. Look what just happened to us with the Trump, the Friday night news last week. We don't want to pursue things that are hurtful to consumers, and we don't want more unnecessary delay. And maybe the thing that speaks the loudest to our public and our leaders is that we also don't want to pay that larger match for another 6 months to a year while we wait on the federal government. So, again, 90-10 versus the 70-30. So what we've got planned here in the immediate future is we already had planned for an event, a public event this Thursday to rally for comments. We've transitioned that into a full expansion now rally, full clean expansion now rally, and that'll be going on tomorrow. We're going to translate a lot of those comments. I think we were over 5,000, translate a lot of those into repurpose them for this new phase that we're in, to fight against what eventually could be another waiver and with some of these negative components. And so we're on a tightrope. It's going to be kind of hard to really explain all this to the public, to make sure our legislators understand where we are, and to really hold the legislature and governor's feet to the fire on making sure we're doing the right thing here, that we're not chasing waivers and delaying and cost taxpayer dollars more, and that they don't try to do something completely different and just derail the path to a potential clean expansion. And I'll also have to say now too is, I don't have all the answers. I think we've just had a few days to talk. Even our advocates out here in Utah and some of our national partners, it's been hard to kind of keep everybody up to speed and figure out what's going on. So what I've said today, some of it may change, some of our thinking may change and our talking points in the next few days, but that's kind of where we are now. I mean, the moral of the story is we feel like we won the battle, but the war wage is on. Again, our political leaders are kind of humiliated right now, and we're waiting to see. The dust hasn't completely settled. We want to kind of wait and see what happens here, and that'll determine our strategy. So that's what I have so far, but I can also answer questions and engage a little later as needed.
Thanks so much, Matt. That's a great recap of both where you came from and what's going on there on the ground here. So we're going to take questions, but we're going to take questions at the end of the presentation. So if people have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll get to those questions once we conclude here. But we'll go now to Elliot Fishman, who's our Senior Director of Health Policy at Families USA and previously served at CMS, where he oversaw many of these 1115 waivers, in fact, all of the 1115 waivers that were coming forward there when he was at CMS. So, Elliot, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you, Matt and UHPP. I'll be talking about the Trump administration in my slides, but I just have to say it has been such a pleasure and an honor to be working with UHPP as they have taken gains where they can, but kept the ultimate goal in mind and kept a path forward to that ultimate goal through some trying times. And we are getting there, and we are closer now than we were afraid we might be. So really just amazing to be working with you. So on your screen now, you are looking at the brief statement that CMS put out about their decision on partial expansion. And there is not a lot of explanation in this Trump administration announcement. But if you look a couple of sentences in, there is a sentence that says, unfortunately, this would invite continued reliance on a broken and unsustainable Obamacare system. So essentially their reason is even partial expansion is Obamacare. What is hidden behind this statement is that there was an intense and lengthy debate within the administration that led up to this. So let's review the history a bit on that. So as Patrick mentioned, I was running the waiver group at CMS from 2013 into the spring of 2017. And the Obama administration opposed partial expansion to low-income adults, first because it is not legal, right? The Affordable Care Act is not written to allow for the enhanced match for partial implementation of the expansion, but second, because it's not good policy. The alternative to Medicaid expansion for people between 100 and 138% of poverty is to go onto the marketplace with premium tax credits. And while the marketplace and premium tax credits are very important in the big picture, for people who are near poverty, it's not nearly as good coverage. And we have documented here at Families USA that you lose about half of your enrollment going from Medicaid coverage and benefits to marketplace coverage and benefits for that population. That policy reasoning was actually a pro within the Trump administration for people who were trying to push for partial expansion. In other words, where in the Obama administration the consideration was what's going to maximize coverage of people, it was essentially the opposite consideration within the Trump administration. So that the supporters, primarily Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar and Administrator of CMS Seema Verma, the supporters of allowing partial expansion were arguing, well, it's better than full expansion from our expensive. It's not as generous as full expansion. And when you look in a state like Utah, that was the choice. That was their framing. While opponents of partial expansion were taking the position that partial expansion is still expansion, and we don't do expansions in the Trump administration, and we don't like Medicaid more broadly in the Trump administration. And keep in mind that the primary opponent of partial expansion, as reported by multiple national reporters, and this played out over about 2 years, was Mick Mulvaney, who had been the head of the Office of Management and Budget, is now Chief of Staff, and is really the most powerful person in the Trump administration. And he has been leading the proposal to slash Medicaid spending by trillions of dollars in every Trump administration budget by using per capita caps and dramatically capping federal Medicaid funding. We'll be talking more about that in a moment. So this was a specific instance of what is broader ideological opposition from very high up in the Trump administration to Medicaid, and they could not bring themselves, even though it would cut Medicaid coverage in a state like Utah, they could not bring themselves to allow for even a partial expansion, right? We describe this as the allergic to Obamacare approach. So the end result was, as Matt described, that not only was much of the executive branch and the legislative branch in Utah really publicly embarrassed. They made a lot of public assurances about this. But Seema Verma, who got out over her skis and was making assurances herself in Utah and other states, also was left holding the bag. She has been notably absent as a spokesperson to explain the decision. So where does this leave us? And in particular, what is next for potentially conservative state legislators, conservative governors, and the White House? So stepping back in the big picture, work requirements are very much still a threat, but the bloom is off the rose with work requirements. I think they are increasingly unattractive, and that there are growing doubts about them in multiple states. We've seen first Arkansas's implementation of work requirements in the fall of 2018, leading to massive disenrollments, and disenrollments that were driven not by people who weren't working, but by people who couldn't deal with the documentation requirements. We saw the same dynamic emerging in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire delayed implementation to try to deal with it. Their governor wound up agreeing with their legislature to facilitate that delay, the Republican governor of New Hampshire. And we are starting to see significant doubts in state legislatures around work requirements. So again, this is not going away as an issue by any means, but there is, I think, no longer the kind of naivete that we saw in 2017 and 2018, that this is just a straightforward thing to implement. Partial expansion, as we've discussed, is now out because the Trump administration won't approve it. So we are anticipating any day a letter from state Medicaid directors, a letter to state Medicaid directors from the Trump administration regarding capping federal funding. And part of the reason that we are particularly expecting that any day is because we think that the holdup in that letter to state Medicaid directors was this issue of partial expansion. Was that going to be one of the inducements that was offered in the letter for Medicaid agencies to take these caps? And now they've made a decision it's not going to be one of the inducements. One of the key questions is, what will be the inducements, right? A state, in accepting caps in their federal funding, is taking on all the risk of increased healthcare costs. So what additional flexibility to cut are they getting in return for taking on that risk? That's going to be a critical question as we watch for that letter to come out. So to elaborate more on this issue of block grants and per capita caps, which has been an issue in Utah and will definitively be an issue in Tennessee, which passed block grant legislation in this year's legislative session, and is potentially an issue in other states. All that a block grant or per capita cap means is that you are capping what the federal government will pay. It doesn't really mean anything positive for states, for state taxpayers, and certainly not for Medicaid beneficiaries and the providers who serve them. It is passing along the growth in healthcare costs to the state and saying you deal with it. There's a base amount that is in some way based on current levels of spending, and then there is an inflation rate which is tied to something other than the actual growth rate of Medicaid costs. That inflation rate can be based on the broader inflation rate in consumer costs in healthcare. That's the way it was structured in the 2017 repeal and replace bills. If If you think about what consumers pay out of pocket, it's pretty distantly related to the underlying cost of those services. You're talking about inflation rates and like copays and deductibles. Those move pretty independently of actual healthcare costs and actual Medicaid costs. But in any event, it is designed to save the federal government money. That is the Trump administration's interest in block grants and per capita caps. They have been extremely explicit about that. They are not hiding it at all. It is in every Trump administration budget, and it is not a small amount of money. So the federal government gets to save a lot of money. States have to decide what they are going to do about the shortfall, and both Medicaid beneficiaries and the providers who serve them have to fight it out to decide who is going to take the hit for the gap that compounds year after year, every year, as that capped amount falls further and further behind the underlying Medicaid costs. And there's only a limited number of ways that you can make the cuts to deal with that artificially limited federal funding. You can cap enrollment, you can cut benefits, you can otherwise cut eligibility. But the only flexibility that a state gets under this arrangement is the flexibility to cut Medicaid. So we see this as where the Trump administration is going. We are concerned that for conservative governors and state legislators, this will become the new flavor of the month. And we are trying to gear up to respond to that, not only in Utah, but across the country.
Great. Thanks so much, Elliot, for giving us that oversight and for explaining how some of this is going to play out going forward. Obviously, the guidance is something that we're continuing to await. The decision on the partial expansion now, I think, takes away what has been, in many cases, a distraction for state legislators. State legislators hoping that they could somehow think about a partial expansion as a way to do something that wouldn't be Obamacare Medicaid expansion. The other issue I think that's out there as a distraction would be the Texas v. U.S. case, which is still out there awaiting a decision in the appellate courts. And let me ask Matt first, just has the Texas v. U.S. case come up in the conversations in Utah, and if so, how?
Yeah, no, thanks, good question. It has come up a couple times with local reporters, and I think one national reporter that I remember, they're really, combining the two. I think it seems as though, again, with the CMS statement there, that, they're talking about how Obamacare is unsustainable. The Washington Post reporting was talking about the Texas v.U.S. decision as a reason why the Trump administration wasn't going to do any sort of special arrangements with Obamacare in red states, that they were awaiting that decision. So it's complicating things. Our perspective is we want the public and our leaders to understand whatever happens at the federal level, it won't happen for a while, and people here are in need. We've got to address, state issues at a state level, and but it has been a tricky one to address, because in one breath, why are you guys going out for Medicaid expansion when, it's going to go away anyway? Well, one, we don't believe it's going to go away, and two, we got to get people coverage now, and that's the end of that story. So that's kind of been our perspective.
So, Elliot, obviously it seems like a long time ago, but it was just the beginning of this month that we actually had the hearing in the appellate court on Texas v. U.S. And are there any signals that we can take from that about the outcome, and where does it go further down the line?
So we are in close communication with the California Attorney General's office that has been leading the effort since the Trump administration, in an unprecedented move, switched sides and took the side that was not the U.S. in Texas v. U.S. California has been defending the U.S., and along with a number of other state attorney general's office and the United States House, they felt really that there were not clear signals coming out of the oral arguments about how that court was going to decide. And in that way, they were somewhat encouraged by that oral argument in that it did not seem like it was simply a baked partisan decision for a panel that was 2 Republican appointees and 1 Democratic appointee. That still means a lot of outcomes are on the table, but it's important to note, first of all, that any decision is almost certainly going to be stayed pending further appeal, whether to the entire Fifth Circuit or potentially to the Supreme Court. And second of all, it's important to note that even a negative decision does not necessarily implicate the Medicaid expansion. In fact, there's a pretty good likelihood that if there is a bad decision at the appellate level, that it will focus on the marketplace protections, the core insurance protections, which of course are really important to tens of millions of people, but do not touch on the Medicaid expansion per se.
Thank you. So we have a question about one of the other ballot initiative states that was up in 2018, Idaho. And the question is, what does the announcement on the partial expansion mean for the Idaho Choice proposal, which had those people between 100 and 138% of the federal poverty level choosing between Medicaid and the marketplace with tax credit coverage?
So I'm going to respond to that with a technical answer and then a political answer. So the technical answer is that it doesn't impact the Idaho Choice proposal in that the authorities that Idaho is pursuing are somewhat different than that partial expansion authority. And those legal authorities are a combined 1332 waiver, which is a waiver under the marketplace, and a Medicaid 1115 waiver. However, from a political perspective, I think it bodes poorly for federal approval of that Idaho proposal, in that what it suggests politically is that the Trump administration is, when it comes to state flexibility, not interested in giving states flexibilities to help them offer coverage to low-income Americans, right? That is not the kind of state flexibility that they are particularly interested in. So if I'm Idaho, I'm looking at this decision, and it's further evidence that that's not going anywhere.
And so for all the other non-expansion states that have been sort of hoping and thinking maybe that somehow if they could just get it down to 100% of the federal poverty level and they could still get the match, that they might end up taking it. That is gone. It's the Trump administration has made their decision, and that is no longer on the table. And so states need to make the decision to go ahead and go forward with a full 138, or continue to turn down millions of dollars in federal funds that could actually come through and help their state coffers. So that seems to be the situation we're at, and with this decision off the table, it's a good one. One question based on that, though, is that what does that mean for full Medicaid expansion? And Matt, it sounds like in Utah what that means is that Phase 3 is a full 138 federal poverty level expansion, but with a number of restrictions and barriers that are included in it, and you have to wait for a waiver to actually be adopted by the feds before you would get to the full 138 expansion. Is that right?
That's correct, right.
Yeah, so that's just Phase 3, but if they were to move straight on to Phase 4, which would be full expansion, my understanding, Elliot, is they could just do that with a state plan amendment and just go ahead and submit that and could move immediately into full expansion.
That's correct. It is the easiest, simplest state plan amendment in the world. It's basically a couple of checkoff boxes.
Great. So we have a question about how would this impact the Missouri 1115 waiver proposal to expand coverage for postpartum women to 12 months for substance use disorder treatment, given the Trump administration's push with the opioid crisis. And I'm not sure that it would affect it, but Elliot?
Yeah, I agree with you, Patrick, that I think that the question is on point, that there are some special considerations with regard to that population that are likely to win out over the broader ideological opposition to covering low-income adults for the Trump administration. I'd say, in general, proposals involving substance use have the Trump administration has been more receptive to those. If you think even about the very small expansion to adults that Utah implemented, it was also along, very small, narrow, targeted expansions for relatively, for populations that are sympathetic on a relatively, non-political basis. Those do have a good chance with this administration.
Okay. And so, Matt, one question about the SB 96. Now, in going through these three phases, will the state now, under SB 96, have to submit a waiver that would have those restrictions in it, or could the state just leapfrog that and go straight to a state plan amendment and full Medicaid expansion?
Well, what we're advocating for is, of course, leapfrogging if possible. SB 96, I think, would allow for that if they could credibly say that they've sought out, waiver permission to do X, Y, and Z, but didn't get it, so we're going to move on. Is there a political appetite to do that? We're hoping there may be. What I'm hearing from the governor's office, and then in kind of reading between the lines in the governor's press release, is that they do want to go to phase 3. But then the question becomes, why don't we just we can do phase 3 and go ahead and implement a state plan amendment and then chase those waivers on the side. That to me would be, the lesser of two evils when it comes to making the expansion a necessary, make it, so if you don't, the way that's worded that they've got to chase the waivers, but can they do that concurrently with seeking a state plan amendment, or do they sort of have to, see if they get the waiver first? When it was the per capita cap /90/10 funding waiver, that is much more of a contingent thing, right? Where it's based on funding, it's based on how far you expand, whereas the provisions they're seeking in phase 3 are more based on the aspects of the program. The one that's a little different potentially is the enrollment cap. So they could sort of say, we'll only do up to 138 if we can get an enrollment cap fixed to X dollar amount or something like that. That's the stuff that we just don't know yet. We're looking forward to finding out. I'd be interested in hearing what Elliot maybe thinks on that, though, too.
So theoretically, they could go ahead and say, we want to expand to 138, and we'll chase these additional restrictions in a separate waiver after we get to the 138. Since the assumption is phase 3 is 138, so you can start getting the federal dollars now, and then see where you end up with on those restrictions, like the enrollment caps and those other things.
Right.
Yeah. So, that'd be the lesser of two evils. We definitely want to get to 138 as quick as possible. We'd rather skip phase 3 completely, but yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm hoping for, is at least to get to 138, because then we have a traditional Medicaid expansion in the state of Utah, and that would be a great place to be.
Yeah, and that has been the process in some other states. Virginia is a great example of that, where they implemented the full expansion and then pursued waivers separate from that. And they've moved forward on that basis, for better or for worse. But, you can point to that like that. It is not a unprecedented or a made-up thing to sequence in that way.
And that was a process that was done under the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So there is precedent for this under the Trump administration to go ahead and do the full expansion and then proceed with the waiver request. And I think that's important to think about here. One final question we have is related back to the work requirements that Elliot was mentioning. And the question is, where is that in the Court of Appeals next, and what's it look like there? So, Elliot?
So we just learned that the D.C. Appellate Court, the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia, will be having oral arguments on the appeals of the Kentucky and Arkansas cases on October 11th. In terms of timing beyond that, we don't know yet, and I'm sure that will be tied into what the actual decision is. But we now know that key date of the oral arguments will be in a little over 2 months.
Right. So that pretty well wraps up what we had for the presentation today. We appreciate everyone joining us, especially Matt Sloniker joining us from Utah today to talk about the situation on the ground. Again, we think that this decision on partial expansion sort of clears the board of one of the major distractions that states have had out there as they've been trying to get at a Medicaid expansion. As Elliot pointed out, there are some additional hurdles that are going to have to be overcome if we're going to be able to provide full Medicaid expansion for people and make sure that that those that are eligible continue to get services without having to face restrictions and barriers to that. But this is a major step in terms of removing a distraction that state folks were facing out there. We appreciate everyone here taking their time to join us on this webinar. Again, it will be made available to folks and posted, both the recording and the slides. And so everyone have a good day, and thanks for your time.